In the heart of Millbrook, a city known for its deep-rooted traditions and slow-to-change mindset, something remarkable was happening. Monica Williams wasn't just making history. She was rewriting it with every step she took. As the first black female police chief in the city's 127-year history, she carried both the weight of responsibility and the dreams of countless others on her shoulders. But this wasn't a position handed to her on a silver platter. Far from it. For 20 years, she'd walked the beat, worked undercover, solved cases that others had given up on, and slowly but surely climbed every rung of the ladder. Her fellow officers used to joke that she spent so much time at the station, she probably had a secret apartment in the building. The truth wasn't far off. Many nights, she'd fall asleep at her desk, surrounded by case files and community proposals. What set Chief Williams apart wasn't just her impressive track record of solving crimes. It was her way of connecting with people. Whether it was the elderly shop owner who needed help with teenagers loitering outside his store, or the young kid skating in places he shouldn't, she had a knack for finding solutions that worked for everyone. She didn't just enforce the law. She helped people understand it, respect it, and feel protected by it. Her office told the story of her journey better than words could. On one wall hung her doctorate in criminal justice from State University, earned through 6 years of night classes while working full-time. Next to it was a collection of community service awards, each with a story of lives touched and neighborhoods transformed. But her most prized possession was a crayon drawing from little Amy, a 7-year-old who'd been scared of police officers until Chief Williams spent an afternoon showing her how to fingerprint her teddy bears. The changes she brought to the department weren't just cosmetic. Within her first year as chief, she'd revolutionized the way officers interacted with the community. Gone were the days of aggressive patrolling and intimidation. Instead, she implemented programs like Coffee with a Cop, where officers would spend morning hours in local diners, just talking with residents. She started a youth mentorship program that paired officers with at-risk teens, helping them see beyond the badge to the human wearing it. Her new accountability standards weren't popular with everyone, of course. Some officers grumbled about the body camera requirements and the mandatory de-escalation training. But the results spoke for themselves. Civilian complaints dropped by 40% in the first year alone. Even the old-timers who'd initially resisted had to admit, things were better this way. When she walked through the station each morning, she made it a point to know everyone's name, from the newest rookie to the janitor who'd been there 30 years. "We're all part of this family," she'd say, and she meant it. Her open-door policy wasn't just talk. Officers and civilian staff alike knew they could come to her with any problem, personal or professional. The local newspaper had recently run a feature about her, highlighting how she transformed the department's approach to community policing. The reporter seemed amazed that she still found time to teach a criminal justice class at the community college every Tuesday night. "It's important to shape the next generation," she'd explained, "to help them understand that protecting and serving means being part of the community, not apart from it." That's why, even after long days at the office, she could often be found at community events, school functions, or just walking through different neighborhoods, talking to people. She believed that true change didn't come from behind a desk. It came from being present, listening, and showing up when people needed you most. Little did she know that her biggest test was just around the corner, one that would challenge not just her leadership, but everything she'd worked so hard to build. It started as just another Tuesday evening in Millbrook. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across Main Street, and Chief Williams had decided to grab dinner at Riley's Diner, a local favorite she'd been visiting for years. She wasn't in uniform, just wearing jeans and a navy blue sweater, looking forward to their famous meatloaf after a long day of budget meetings. The bell of the door chimed as she walked in, and several regular customers waved hello. Mrs. Chen, who'd owned the flower shop next door for 30 years, was just finishing her coffee. "Chief, join me for pie later," she called out. But before Williams could answer, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. Officer James Barrett had been with the department for 8 years, and something about him had always seemed off. He walked in right behind the chief, and even though she'd reviewed his performance reports just last week, he was staring at her like she was a stranger, and not in a good way. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," Barrett announced loudly, his hand resting on his belt. The diner grew quiet. The clinking of forks against plates stopped. Even the sizzling from the grill seemed to fade away. "Officer Barrett," Chief Williams said calmly, recognizing him immediately. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm your—" I said, "Show me your ID." He cut her off, his voice getting louder. Now, the way he emphasized that last word made several diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. The chief kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. She'd dealt with situations like this before, but never from one of her own officers. "Officer Barrett, I'm Chief Williams. We had a department meeting just this morning about the new community outreach program." But Barrett wasn't listening. His face had taken on a reddish tinge, and his breathing had become heavy. "Look, lady, I don't know what game you're playing, but our chief isn't." He paused, and the next words came out dripping with disbelief. "Someone like you." The cook behind the counter, who'd known the chief for years, started to speak up, but she gave him a subtle shake of her head. This needed to be handled carefully. She slowly reached for her purse to get her ID, explaining her movements as she went. "I'm reaching for my credentials," she said clearly, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. But Barrett apparently saw something threatening in her careful movements. "Stop! Hands where I can see them," he shouted, and suddenly his hand was on his weapon. Several customers gasped. A child at a nearby table started crying. Chief Williams froze, her hands visible. 20 years of police work had taught her that this moment was crucial. One wrong move could turn this situation dangerous, not just for her, but for everyone in the diner. "Dispatch, this is Officer Barrett," he barked into his radio. "I've got a suspicious individual at Riley's diner, possibly armed, making threatening movements." The absurdity of the situation would have been almost funny if it wasn't so serious. Within minutes, the quiet evening at Riley's had turned into a scene. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as 3 patrol cars pulled up outside. Mrs. Chen was recording everything on her phone, her hands shaking but determined. The dinner crowd watched in stunned silence as their police chief, the woman who'd revolutionized their department, who'd helped their kids with homework at the community center, who'd created programs that made their streets safer, was being treated like a criminal. When Barrett's backup arrived, they stopped dead in their tracks, immediately recognizing their chief. But Barrett was already pulling out his handcuffs, ignoring their shocked expressions. The metallic click of the cuffs closing around Chief Williams's wrists echoed through the silent diner, a sound that would soon echo through the entire city and beyond. The next few minutes at Riley's diner felt like a slow-motion nightmare. Chief Williams stood there, handcuffed in front of the place where she'd celebrated her promotion just 2 years ago. The same counter where she'd sat sharing coffee with elderly residents, listening to their concerns about neighborhood safety. The same booths where she'd helped kids with their homework while their parents finished their shifts. "Sir, that's the chief." Officer Thompson, one of the backup officers, stepped forward with wide eyes. "What are you doing?" But Barrett wasn't backing down. His face was set in stone, a strange mix of anger and something else. Maybe fear, maybe pride. It was hard to tell. "This woman claims to be the chief." Barrett spat out the words. She was reaching for something in her bag. Could have been a weapon. His voice was shaking slightly, but whether from adrenaline or the dawning realization that he'd made a massive mistake, nobody could tell. The small crowd gathering outside pressed their faces against the diner's windows. Inside, teenage buzzboy was live-streaming everything on his phone. Mrs. Chen had moved closer, still recording, her usual cheerful face now lined with worry and anger. "I've known the chief for years," she called out. "This is absolutely ridiculous." Chief Williams remained remarkably calm, though the metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists. She trained her officers about situations exactly like this, about how unconscious bias could cloud judgment, about the importance of de-escalation. Now she was living it, right here in her own community, at the hands of one of her own officers. "Officer Barrett," she said quietly, her voice steady despite everything. "My ID is in my purse. The same ID you've seen me use to access the building every morning for the past 2 years. Officer Thompson here can verify my identity. Let's handle this professionally." But Barrett was too far gone. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he called for even more backup, claiming the situation was escalating. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The only one escalating things was Barrett himself. More patrol cars arrived, their sirens cutting through the evening air. The night shift was just starting, and officers who'd worked with the chief for years pulled up to find their leader in handcuffs. The look of shock on their faces would have been almost comical in any other situation. Inside the diner, little Annie, who'd been enjoying a milkshake with her dad, started crying harder. Chief Williams had helped Annie's family when their house was broken into last year, spending extra time to make sure the little girl felt safe again in her own home. Now Annie watched, confused and scared, as her hero stood there in handcuffs. "It's okay, Annie," Chief Williams called out softly, still thinking of others despite her situation. "Everything's going to be all right." She managed a small smile at the girl, trying to turn this moment into a teaching opportunity even now. The diner's owner, Mr. Riley, had come out from the kitchen. He'd served the chief lunch at least twice a week for the past 15 years. "This is insane," he muttered, pulling out his own phone to call the mayor. Others were already on their phones, calling local news stations, posting on social media. The incident was spreading across the internet like wildfire. Officer Thompson tried again to reason with Barrett. "Sir, this is Chief Williams. Remember, she led the department meeting this morning, the community outreach program." But Barrett stood his ground, his hands still hovering near his weapon, as if the handcuffed woman in front of him posed any threat at all. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Through the windows, more community members were gathering, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. Some held up their phones, recording. Others just stood there, shaking their heads in dismay. Inside, Chief Williams took a deep breath. This moment, as horrible as it was, would not be wasted. She'd use it to show her department and her community exactly how to handle injustice with dignity. Sometimes the best lessons come from the hardest moments, and she was determined to turn this display of prejudice into a catalyst for real change. By midnight, the video of Chief Williams' arrest had spread across every social media platform. People weren't just sharing it. They were demanding answers. The incident that began in a small-town diner had become a national conversation of police reform and racial bias. The local news stations camped outside the police station, their vans creating a small village of satellite dishes and cameras. Inside, the mayor had arrived, his tie askew and face flushed from rushing over as soon as he'd heard. The look on his face when he saw the chief still in handcuffs told its own story. "Get those off her. Now," he commanded, his voice echoing through the station. Barrett, who'd been trying to justify his actions to his supervising officer, suddenly found great interest in studying his shoes. The click of the handcuffs being removed seemed to echo through the silent room. Outside, the crowd had grown from a handful of concerned citizens to hundreds. They carried signs made from cardboard boxes and printer paper, clearly put together in a hurry but powerful in their message. "Stand with Chief Williams" and "End police bias" were written in bold letters. But what made this protest different was who held those signs. There were teachers from the local high school where the chief gave monthly talks about community policing. Small business owners who had seen their neighborhoods become safer under her leadership. Elderly residents who finally felt safe walking to the corner store because of her community patrol programs. Even off-duty officers joined the crowd, still in uniform, standing in silent support of their leader. Mrs. Chen had organized a group of local business owners who'd closed their shops early to be there. Mr. Riley from the diner handed out free coffee to the protesters, telling anyone who'd listened about how the chief had helped his grandson stay out of trouble by getting him involved in the youth mentoring program. Local religious leaders arrived, forming a prayer circle that grew to include people of all faiths. They weren't just praying for justice, they were praying for change, for understanding, for their community to heal and grow stronger from this. The police union representatives showed up, expecting to defend Officer Barrett, but the evidence was overwhelming. The body cam footage, the multiple witness videos, the chief's spotless record versus Barrett's history of complaints. It painted a clear picture that couldn't be ignored. Inside the station, Chief Williams sat in her office, finally free of the handcuffs but heavily weighted by responsibility. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages of support from police chiefs across the country, civil rights leaders, and community members. But she wasn't thinking about the national attention. She was thinking about little Annie from the diner and all the other children who'd witnessed what happened. "We need to make this mean something," she told the mayor and her senior staff. "This isn't about me. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else." Even now, she was thinking like a leader, turning a personal humiliation into an opportunity for positive change. The local newspaper's website crashed from too many people trying to read their breaking news story. Their headline was simple but powerful. Police chiefs arrest sparks community uprising for change. The comments section was flooded with stories from community members sharing their own experiences with the chief. How she'd helped their family, attended their community events, or simply took the time to listen when nobody else would. By dawn, national news networks had picked up the story. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't just the incident itself, it was the response. Instead of violence or destruction, the community had come together in peaceful support. Senior citizens stood alongside teenagers. Business owners joined hands with their employees. Off-duty officers stood with civilian protesters. This wasn't just another protest. This was a community standing up and saying, "Not here. Not to her. Not to anyone." The crowd outside the station had grown so large that they had to close several streets. But there was no anger, no violence. Just a determined community united in their demand for justice and change. The state attorney general's office didn't waste any time. Within 48 hours of the incident, a team of investigators had taken over the third floor of the Millbrook Police Department. They weren't just looking into what happened at Riley's diner. They were digging deep into Officer Barrett's entire career. The lead investigator, a seasoned professional with salt and pepper hair, sat at a desk surrounded by stacks of personnel files. What she found made her stomach turn. Barrett's file was thick with warning signs that nobody had acted on. There were complaints from minority drivers about unnecessary traffic stops, reports of excessive force that had been dismissed, notes from previous supervisors about concerning behavior that had been brushed aside. "Look at this," she said to her team, holding up a report from 3 years ago. A young black woman had filed a complaint about Barrett's aggressive behavior during a routine traffic stop. The complaint had been marked resolved, with no further action. The woman's statement was heartbreaking. "I was scared for my life, but nobody seemed to care." The investigation spread beyond Barrett. They interviewed every officer who'd worked with him, every supervisor who'd overseen him. The picture that emerged wasn't just about one bad officer. It revealed a system that had allowed prejudice to go unchecked before Chief Williams took over. Meanwhile, in the department's break room, officers were coming forward with their own stories. "Remember when he refused to patrol the east side?" One officer said, shaking his head. "Said it wasn't worth his time." Another recalled how Barrett had made uncomfortable comments during diversity training sessions. The investigators discovered text messages on Barrett's work phone that made their blood run cold. Messages to other officers complaining about having a black woman as chief. Plans to undermine her authority. The incident at the diner wasn't a random act of bias. It was a deliberate attempt to humiliate her. They interviewed Mrs. Chen for hours. Her video of the incident was crucial evidence, but what really struck the investigators was how she described the chief's impact on the community. "Before Chief Williams, I was afraid to call the police," she explained, wiping away tears. "Now, or at least before this happened, I felt safe." She changed things here. The investigation also revealed something unexpected. Since Chief Williams had taken over, civilian complaints had dropped dramatically, except for those against Barrett and a small group of officers who shared his views. These officers had resisted every reform she tried to implement, from community policing initiatives to bias training. In the evidence room, investigators found more disturbing patterns. Cases Barrett had handled involving minority citizens showed a clear bias in his reporting. Simple infractions were blown out of proportion, while serious complaints from minority communities were downplayed or ignored. The state's forensic team analyzed Barrett's bodycam footage from the past year. They found a pattern of him turning off his camera during certain interactions, directly violating department policy. The footage from the diner incident showed something even more damning. He'd recognized the chief immediately, but chose to escalate the situation anyway. Local business owners came forward with security camera footage showing Barrett's previous interactions in their stores. A pattern emerged of him treating people differently based on their race. The owner of the local convenience store had hours of footage showing Barrett being overly aggressive with minority customers while staying friendly with others. The investigation wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. It was about understanding how someone like Barrett had managed to stay on the force for so long. Each interview, each piece of evidence, painted a picture of systemic issues that had been ignored or overlooked until Chief Williams arrived. As the investigation drew to a close, the lead investigator sat in her car outside the police station, reviewing her notes. The case against Barrett was solid, but the bigger story was about change. How one leader's efforts to transform a department had threatened those who preferred the old way of doing things. The incident at the diner wasn't just about one officer's bias. It was about resistance to progress itself. The discovery of Barrett's text messages shook the entire department to its core. In a small windowless room at the Internal Affairs office, investigators pieced together months of conversations that revealed a disturbing truth. What happened at Riley's diner wasn't a split-second mistake. It was the result of careful planning. "Got to show her she doesn't belong here." One message read, sent just days before the incident. "Wait till you see what I've got planned." Read another. The timestamps showed these messages were sent during shift hours, sometimes right after department meetings where Chief Williams had introduced new community engagement policies. The tech team recovered deleted messages that painted an even darker picture. A small group of officers, led by Barrett, had created a private chat group they called the Old Guard. Their conversations were filled with complaints about every change the chief had made, every barrier to discrimination she'd torn down, every step toward progress she'd taken. "She's trying to turn us into social workers," one message complained after the chief introduced a new mental health response program. "Next thing you know, we'll be having tea parties with criminals," another officer had written when she started the community dialogue sessions. But what really caught everyone's attention was the photo they found on Barrett's work computer. It was a picture of Chief Williams at her swearing-in ceremony, but it had been edited with cruel, racist symbols. The metadata showed he'd been working on this during his shifts, using department resources to spread hate. The investigation revealed something else too. Barrett had been keeping detailed notes on the chief's daily routine. He knew she often went to Riley's diner on Tuesdays. He knew she usually didn't wear her uniform there. He'd been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to humiliate her in front of the community she'd worked so hard to serve. In the break room, officers who'd never spoken up before started sharing stories. He tried to recruit me to his little group. One young officer admitted, hands shaking around his coffee cup, said I needed to choose sides, said things were changing too fast, that we needed to take back control. The evidence room became a testament to years of hidden bias. Folders of unfiled complaints, reports that had been altered, body cam footage that had conveniently malfunctioned during certain encounters, all tied back to Barrett and his small group of supporters. One particularly disturbing piece of evidence was a recorded conversation between Barrett and another officer in a patrol car. They were discussing Chief Williams's new accountability measures. We just need one big mistake, Barrett had said. One public embarrassment, and they'll see she's not fit for the job. The investigation revealed that Barrett had even tried to interfere with the chief's successful programs. He deliberately skipped community meetings, filed incorrect reports about the success rates of her initiatives, and tried to discourage other officers from participating in her reforms. In her own office, Chief Williams reviewed the evidence with a heavy heart. She remembered hiring Barrett, believing in his potential to serve the community. She'd seen signs of his resistance to change, but had hoped training and exposure to new ideas would help him grow. Now, reading through his messages, she realized some people didn't want to grow. They wanted to drag everyone else back into the past. The most revealing discovery came from Barrett's personal department email. He'd been corresponding with retired officers who'd left when Chief Williams was appointed, planning what they called Operation Restore Order. Their goal wasn't just to undermine her. They wanted to undo every positive change she'd brought to the department and the community. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that Barrett's actions at the diner weren't just about racial bias. They were the desperate acts of someone who saw the world changing and couldn't handle it. His resistance to progress, his fear of change, and his prejudice had combined into a toxic mixture that finally exploded that Tuesday evening at Riley's diner. The revelations sent shockwaves through the department. Officers who'd worked with Barrett for years couldn't believe the extent of his deception. But for every disturbing discovery, there was also a sign of hope. Younger officers coming forward to share their own experiences. Veteran officers admitting they should have spoken up sooner, and a department ready to face its problems honestly and work toward real change. The day of Barrett's disciplinary hearing arrived with an unusual calm. The morning sun painted the city hall steps golden, where a crowd had gathered since dawn. But this wasn't an angry mob seeking revenge. This was a community united in their pursuit of justice and change. Inside the hearing room, Chief Williams sat straight-backed in her chair, her uniform crisp and perfect. She'd spent the night before not planning revenge, but drafting a comprehensive reform proposal. This isn't about punishment, she told her staff. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else. Barrett entered looking smaller somehow, his confident strut replaced by uncertain steps. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but what really seemed to break him was the disappointed faces of his fellow officers. These weren't just colleagues, they were people who had trusted him, backed him up in dangerous situations, shared meals with his family. The hearing wasn't just about that one incident at Riley's diner. As each piece of evidence was presented, a pattern of biased and deliberate sabotage emerged. Text messages, altered reports, tampered body camera footage. The room grew heavier with each revelation. But when it was Chief Williams's turn to speak, she surprised everyone. Instead of calling for Barrett's immediate termination, she presented something more powerful: a complete overhaul of the department's accountability systems. Today, we have a choice, she began, her voice steady and clear. We can focus on punishment, or we can focus on progress. What happened to me at Riley's diner happens to citizens every day across our country. The only difference is I wear a badge and had hundreds of witnesses. Her proposal included creating an independent civilian oversight committee, not just for serious incidents, but for regular review of police interactions. She called for mandatory body camera reviews, enhanced bias training led by community members, and a new system for tracking and addressing civilian complaints. Officer Barrett's actions weren't born in a vacuum, she continued. They grew in the shadows of a system that needed updating. Today, we bring everything into the light. In the audience, Mrs. Chen from the flower shop wiped tears from her eyes. Mr. Riley, who'd closed his diner to be there, nodded solemnly. Little Annie, who'd witnessed the incident, sat with her parents, watching history unfold. The most powerful moment came when other officers started standing up, one by one, to share their own stories. Stories of times they'd seen biased but stayed quiet. Times they'd wanted to speak up but feared retaliation. Times they wished they'd done more. Barrett sat there, watching his former colleagues find their voices. The weight of his actions seemed to finally hit him as he heard how his behavior had affected not just the chief, but the entire community's trust in law enforcement. When the committee announced their decision, it wasn't just about Barrett's termination. They unanimously approved Chief Williams's reform proposals. The crowd outside erupted in cheers when the news reached them, but it wasn't celebrating someone's downfall. They were celebrating the beginning of real change. The chief's office became a hub of activity in the following days. Officers lined up to volunteer for the new training programs. Community members called offering to help with the oversight committee. Even retired officers reached out, admitting they'd been wrong about the changes she tried to implement. Local businesses put up signs supporting the new initiatives. The community college offered free spaces for training sessions. Religious leaders, business owners, and neighborhood groups all stepped forward to be part of the solution. In her quiet moments, Chief Williams would look at the photo on her desk, a picture of her graduation from the police academy, young and idealistic. She joined the force to make a difference, and now, through this difficult experience, she was doing exactly that. The incident that could have divided the department and the community had instead brought them closer together. It wasn't just about one officer facing consequences. It was about a whole community choosing to grow, to learn, and to build something better for the future. 6 months after the Riley's Diner incident, the Millbrook Police Department looked like a different place entirely. The changes weren't just on paper. You could feel them in the air, see them in the way officers interacted with citizens, hear them in the conversations echoing through the halls. The old break room, once filled with grumbling about paperwork, now hosted weekly community meetings. Today, a group of teenagers sat with officers, working together to plan a basketball tournament that would bring police and young people together. The walls, once bare except for doobie rosters, now displayed photos of community events and thank you letters from residents. Chief Williams's reform program had caught national attention. Police departments from across the country sent representatives to learn from Millbrook's transformation. They'd expected to find complicated protocols and strict regulations. Instead, they found something much more powerful, a complete shift in culture. The new Civilian Oversight Committee met in what used to be an unused storage room, now transformed into a bright meeting space. Mrs. Chen, now a committee member, often brought flowers from her shop to brighten the room. Today, she was reviewing body camera footage not to catch mistakes, but to identify officers who'd gone above and beyond in helping citizens. The mandatory bias training had evolved into something unexpected. Instead of dry lectures, it became a series of community conversations. Officers spent time in local businesses, learning about different cultures and traditions. They attended community events not as security, but as participants. The barriers between us and them were slowly crumbling. One morning, Chief Williams arrived to find a line of people outside her office. But they weren't there to file complaints. They were there to volunteer for the department's new mentorship program. Teachers, business owners, retired officers, and community leaders all wanted to help guide the next generation of police officers. The department's approach to mental health calls had completely changed. Where they once sent armed officers to every situation, They now had teams that included social workers and mental health professionals. The results were impressive. Fewer confrontations, better outcomes, and stronger community trust. In the dispatch center, new protocols were in place. Every call was handled with cultural sensitivity in mind. The dispatchers had received special training to recognize potential bias in calls and how to respond appropriately. The woman who'd once called police on a group of kids playing basketball in the street now volunteered at the community center's youth program. The local newspaper ran a special feature titled Transformation in Blue, documenting the changes. They interviewed Officer Thompson, who'd been on scene that night at Riley's diner. "We're not just enforcing laws anymore," he said. "We're building relationships, solving problems, making real connections with people." The youth mentorship program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Every afternoon, the station's community room filled with young people getting homework help from officers, learning about law enforcement, or just having conversations about life. The sound of laughter regularly echoed through halls that had once been silent and intimidating. Even the physical space had changed. The stark walls were now covered with community artwork. The front desk, once protected by thick glass, was now open and welcoming. Officers' desk nameplates included the languages they spoke, making it easier for non-English speaking residents to find help. The department's statistics told a powerful story. Civilian complaints had dropped by 80%. Response times improved. Crime rates decreased, not because of aggressive policing, but because the community and police were working together to prevent problems before they started. Other departments started sending their officers to train in Millbrook. They came expecting to learn about policies and procedures, but left understanding something more fundamental: that real police work isn't about power over a community, but partnership with it. Chief Williams's reform model was being studied at police academies across the country. But she wasn't interested in fame or recognition. Her focus remained on Millbrook, on continuing to build bridges, on making sure every interaction between police and citizens helped heal old wounds and build new trust. 1 year after that fateful night at Riley's Diner, the whole community gathered for what they called the Unity Festival in the town square. The weather was perfect, sunny with a gentle breeze carrying the smell of food from local vendors who'd set up stalls around the park. Chief Williams stood on the small stage, looking out at the crowd. What she saw brought tears to her eyes. Officers in uniform playing basketball with teenagers on the portable court they'd set up. Children getting their faces painted by police cadets. Elderly residents chatting with patrol officers over cups of Mrs. Chen's famous tea. Riley's Diner had set up a booth serving their famous meatloaf right next to the police department's community outreach table. The spot where Barrett had once handcuffed her had become a symbol of transformation. Mr. Riley had even named a new menu item, the Chief's Special, a plate of comfort food that always came with a side of friendly conversation. The changes in the department had created ripples far beyond Millbrook. News crews from national networks were there, not to cover protests or conflicts, but to document what real police reform looked like. They interviewed community members who spoke about feeling safer not because of increased police presence, but because they knew the officers as people who cared. Little Annie, who'd watched the chief's arrest in tears a year ago, now led tours of the police station's new youth center. "This is where we do our homework," she'd tell visitors proudly. "And that's where the officers teach us about leadership." The fear in her eyes from that night had been replaced with confidence and trust. The Oversight Committee had become a model for other cities. Instead of just reviewing complaints, they actively worked with officers to improve community relations. Mrs. Chen, still serving on the committee, had started a program where business owners offered internships to at-risk youth, with police officers serving as mentors. Even some of Barrett's former supporters had come around. One officer, who'd initially resisted the changes, now ran the department's cultural awareness training program. "I was wrong," he'd admitted publicly. "I thought being tough meant being distant. Now I know that real strength comes from being part of the community. The department's new hiring process included community input. Potential officers didn't just face an interview board. They spent time in the community, volunteering at local organizations, getting to know the people they'd be serving. The result was a new generation of officers who saw themselves as guardians rather than warriors. Chief Williams had turned down numerous offers for promotions to bigger cities. "My heart is here," she'd tell them. "This is where the real work happens." She'd written a book about the department's transformation, not for profit, but as a guide for other communities wanting to create change. The festival reached its peak as the sun began to set. Local musicians played on stage while families spread blankets on the grass. Officers joined in community dances, their uniforms mixed with civilian clothes in a visual representation of the barriers that had come down. What happened that night at Riley's Diner could have broken the community. Instead, it had become the catalyst for real change. The incident wasn't forgotten. It was transformed into a teaching moment, a turning point, a reminder that progress often comes from facing difficult truths. As darkness fell, someone started passing out candles. Soon, the entire square was lit with hundreds of tiny flames. Chief Williams looked out at the faces illuminated by candlelight. Officers and civilians, young and old, people of all backgrounds standing together. She thought about Barrett, who was now working in another state, required to undergo extensive training before he could ever wear a badge again. The department's response to his actions hadn't just been about punishment. It had been about transformation, about showing that change was possible if people were willing to learn and grow. The night ended with a community choir singing songs of hope and unity. As their voices filled the air, Chief Williams realized that what they'd built in Millbrook wasn't just a better police department. It was a template for what community policing could be everywhere. The path hadn't been easy, but the results were worth every step of the journey.